All right, Jim, our next question, sent on Twitter using the hashtag CornyDriveThru from Grant Cameron. What are your thoughts on Mario Mancini saying Hulk Hogan used his influence to have George Scott removed as Booker because he wanted to push Randy Savage as champion? I have a quote here. This is from the Mario Mancini show.
I swear to God.
I would have had a different career if George Scott stayed the Booker and not
that's
Pat
a good
Patterson.
lead line. That's a good lead line.
George Scott got fired because he wanted to put the strap on Randy Savage right away. Hogan, he went, he pitched, and he bitched to Vince, and Vince fired George and brought in Pat. Have you ever heard that before, that George Scott was fired for wanting to put the belt on Randy Savage?
No, because that's not the case. And I love it when he says, I would have had a lot different career if because George liked me. And that's, here's the thing. George Scott was fired by Vince McMahon. And the one time I'll say something good about George Scott, who I never liked and would never again say anything good about, Alzheimer's ridden piece of shit. But he was fired by Vince McMahon for being too much of a wrestling guy. The whole national expansion, the whole cartoon wrestling thing, the whole entertainment, the Tuesday Night Titans. George Scott had been a wrestler since the early 1950s. And he and Sandy had been a top tag team. Then he transitioned into booking. He was supposedly, according to some people you speak to, the architect of the transition from Crockett Promotions in the Carolinas going to a mid-level tag team territory that had done steady business for decades to the premier Lincoln Continental Cadillac of the NWA territories, running all the big buildings in the Carolinas with Flair and Steamboat and Snuka and Youngblood and blah, 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 blah. He was the booker during all that time, but he also was smart enough to bring in Johnny Valentine and bring in Blackjack Mulligan and bring in Wahoo McDaniel, that then suggested their own angles and their own programs that they had done in previous territories to get over. And Wahoo said, oh, you ought to bring that Ric Flair in. So if George Scott was any good in his day, some say he was and some say he was lucky. By the time that I met him in 1989, it was gone. However, I worked in the office. I've talked to a variety of principals on both sides of the Scott situation, and basically Vince couldn't get along with him because, and I can identify with this, George Scott was too wrestling. He didn't want the fucking phony hokey shit. He didn't want the fucking entertainment. He wanted, wrestling. And he was not somebody that Vince could sit down and share that vision with. And there were a couple things that I think that they argued about after the first WrestleMania. I don't think George Scott was a fan of the big payoffs that the guys got. But it just came down to Pat was more willing to open. He was a wrestling guy, but he was also an easier going, more fun loving kind of guy. It was more personable than George Scott. Had worked for Vince as a wrestler, for 4 or 5 years at that point, main evented the Garden, been a title contender. They were closer, and Pat was much more suited to the vision of wrestling that Vince wanted to do rather than George Scott, who honestly, and then, 4 years later in 1989, he was goddamn completely deranged. It was like he hadn't watched a wrestling program in 15 years. So it wasn't about just, and obviously no, because think about this. Savage, when did Savage come in?
The end of 85 or mid 85.
Scott, that was after George Scott was already on the way out when Randy first got there, wasn't he?
Well, he was there a little while longer because remember, eventually in 80s...
But I mean, you're on the way. You're on a downhill trajectory in some of these points.
In 84, the big feuds they had were Slaughter and the Sheik, Piper and Snuka, despite Snuka's substance abuse issues, meaning he had to go away, and then it became Piper versus Tonga Kid.
Right.
And Hogan had no opponent. Hogan was the touring attraction as world champion. He was that hot. One town he would wrestle Iron Sheik. Next town he would wrestle Big John Studd. 85, you finally get your first Hogan feud, him and Piper. There's no ending to that. Piper got along with George Scott, by the way, I believe.
Oh, God, yeah.
Hogan,
because they had worked so long in the Carolinas.
But Hogan, knowing what he wanted to be and looking out for himself better than maybe any wrestler ever has, and knowing what Vince wanted, I believe Hogan did sour on George Scott, and that's one of the reasons.
I'm sure he was.
You know, remember though, Vince, there's a period of time, it's a weird period of time in 87 where Vince all of a sudden let some of his guys work for World Class, and George Scott started booking there. And Tony Atlas was Black Superman, and they had Ricky Steamboat for a show, and the Iron Sheik. So there was still some kind of open door with George Scott and Vince. But he was.
I think that was a flare up of Vince wanting to take over Dallas again. And thinking, well, maybe George is booking, and if I send a few guys down, some of his old guys from the Carolinas, and do him a favor, maybe I can get my finger in there some kind of way. Because at the time, I mean, the business in Dallas was the weakest it had ever been.
So considering your personal experience with George Scott, and also the fact that as a wrestling fan, as a wrestling historian, even then, you knew the success he had at Mid-Atlantic, after your problems, 89, 90, 91, did you talk to anyone like Flair and just say, like, what the fuck was the deal with this guy back then? Was he ever any good? Was it a myth? What have you determined about George Scott's biggest booking successes?
Well, everybody that knew him in the 70s, oh, it was great. Oh, we were doing nothing but business. Oh, George Scott. What about now? We just signed the Iron Sheik in 1989. They just rolled their eyes. They couldn't, nobody that had known him in both places could reconcile the two. And I had just known him on the last one, and plus that he wasn't a friendly person. He wasn't gregarious. He didn't have personality. He was a taciturn old stick in the mud. And it was like somebody had woken him up to come to book this thing from a long coma, not a nap.
How different personality-wise is he from Sandy Scott?
Jesus Christ. Well, that's the thing. And as many miles as I rode in the car with Sandy, as many times as I worked with him over a period of over 10 years, all I know was they hadn't spoken in 20 years. I still don't know what it was. Something personal between the two of them. Sandy felt highly offended by it. And it was known within the business that they didn't speak at all. As a matter of fact, I missed this, but I was told about it. The time that George Scott came to his first meeting as booker in WCW, when Sandy Scott was still there from the Crockett days, they had kept him on as a live event promoter. They were both at CNN Center and going to have a meeting or be in a meeting at the WCW office. And the first time they'd seen each other in person, and I think at that point somebody said, almost 15 years, like since the Carolina days or whatever. Well, maybe almost 10 years.
But Sandy Scott didn't work for the office when George Scott was there?
No, that's what I was going to say. George Scott left at 82, and this was 89, so 7 years. But the first time they'd seen each other in person in 7 years, they got on the elevator and just turned and stared at the front doors and never said hello and spoke to each other. That's how fucking much that heat was. And they were Canadian, so Sandy had a dry humor to him, but he had humor to him. And he was a nice guy, and he was honest, and he was truthful. And he was fairly, if you knew his particular quirks, he used to fuck with people, just, like New Jack, always wanted paid in cash. And he'd have a check written that he could cash that Monday, but he'd always have to be paid in cash. So that meant waiting till after the box office was checked up, right? So you had cash. Well, he would always pester Sandy, and he knew Sandy hadn't checked up yet, so Sandy started, every time he'd ask that, he'd give him an empty envelope. And New Jack would open it. It'd be envelope with New Jack name on it, but nothing in it. And he'd get so mad. And I said, well, then wait until he's counted the fucking money before you pester him. Anyway, so the point is that Sandy and George did not speak or get along at all. They had no relationship whatsoever. And knowing the two of them, I'm willing to take Sandy's side in that one. But yeah, they got on the elevator, had not seen each other in person since George Scott left Crockett Promotions, and didn't even say hello.
What did Sandy Scott ever say to you about the way George treated you in the Express?
Well, here's the thing.
Because it's such an odd way. It's also odd how that all went down.
Well, I think it was probably George Scott coming in figuring I'll just do what Jim Herd wants me to do or say what he wants me to say because this is the first job I've had that paid me any amount of money in the wrestling business since Vince fired me 5 years ago. And goddamn, whatever. I don't know. He had not seen anybody except for Flair and Steamboat. He knew those and the Iron Sheik. I don't think he knew anybody else, and maybe Ole, if Ole was still. No, Ole was gone by then. And, I wasn't going to sit down with Sandy and talk about the brother that I knew he hadn't spoken to in years and years and say, well, why was he such a dick when Sandy already knew he was a dick? But nobody has really ever been able to explain it. But he just... That's why I thought he was losing George Scott was losing. He was Alzheimer's or something, because if he was any kind of booker at any point, he wouldn't have done what he did in WCW in '89.
Did Vince ever say anything to you about him?
I remember that's where I got he and Vince didn't fit with their viewpoint of wrestling, because George Scott was even more of an old-fashioned traditionalist than I might be called. And so, I mean, there was occasional eye rolling and a reference to, George Scott, but he definitely wasn't into the sports entertainment. George wasn't. And I can't argue with him there, but, you take the job with Vince, you got to do what you got to do.